I met Ms. Siders back at a seminar at UMass in Boston about the topic we're talking about tonight, and I thought she was a really dynamic speaker and invited her to come up and give a presentation here. And since that time, she took a position down at the University of Delaware, so physically we couldn't get her up here, so this was the next best thing. But I think it's going to work out well. Just a little bit about the topic. So I'm a member of Newburyport's Climate Resiliency Committee, and we're issuing a climate resiliency plan for the city. And basically, you know, we're looking at climate hazards, we're looking at the city's vulnerabilities, and there are basically three methods to deal with vulnerabilities. And one, of course, is protecting an asset. So, for example, the wastewater treatment plant or the Lower Artichoke Reservoir could be protected for a while. At some point, once protection is not feasible, then you need to adapt, and you try to accommodate the hazard as best you can. But ultimately, at some point, there comes a time when it's just not technically feasible or physically possible to protect an asset or even one's home, and then leaving that site is what's known as retreat. So that's kind of the process of how we handle dealing with climate hazards. So, without any further delay, I want to introduce Ms. Siders. How are we doing? Can we hear you?
Thank you to Storm Surge for having me and for having me in this unconventional way. I really appreciate being able to present from Delaware. I love having these types of conversations and having this, talking to people about retreat and what it means for their communities. And sometimes, unfortunately, travel just doesn't make that possible. So I'm hoping everyone can see my slides, and we're going to talk about managed retreat and coastal adaptation and how those fit together. And I'm going to start actually with, starting with my hometown. So I'm from Duluth, Minnesota. I mention this because this is a beautiful place. Everyone thinks our hometown is beautiful, but Duluth, Minnesota is definitely one of the beautiful ones. And I grew up right on the lake, on Lake Superior. I know that growing up on the lake doesn't sound like a lot to people who live on by the ocean and have that oceanfront view, but being by the water is really important to everyone in our town. It's part of the economy, it's part of our way of life, it's part of everything that's about it. And I say this is my hometown, even though I moved away 17 years ago. I moved away 17 years ago, but home is still Duluth, Minnesota. And the reason I start with that is because what I'm talking about is managed retreat is people moving away from their homes, away from places where they've lived and developed that deep connection. And I understand that this is difficult to do, right? That change of any type is going to be difficult, whether that's Brexit turning out to be far more difficult than people thought it was going to be, whether that's Homer giving up donuts, myself giving up donuts, or any type of change. Even when we know change is good for us, even when we know moving away is a good decision, it's for a new job, it's for family, it's for safety, it can still be really difficult. That doesn't make it any less painful. And I want to start just by just acknowledging that. I know that this is a difficult conversation, and I really appreciate that you're here to think about it today. Because I am not going to tell you to move away. I'm not here to tell you to leave your home. And despite the way I titled this talk, I'm not even here to tell you when exactly you should leave your home. What I do want to tell you is that I think you should consider retreat for your town, for your community, for the region, for the state. As a country, as Americans, we need to start thinking about retreat. And so I hope that having this conversation today will at least get you to start thinking about whether it's the right answer for you. And if it's not the right answer for you, to start thinking about how you can help support other people who retreat, who want to retreat, where retreat is the right answer for them. Because there are going to be some people like that. So we all know there are risks. None of you, I think, are unaware of them. This is a map I pulled of Newburyport's flood map. So you can see there are major flood risk areas in the town, and just pulling some of the more recent news stories about floods and storms and damage that are happening in the area. None of you are surprised by the fact that you live in a place that experiences flood on a regular basis. Homes are getting flooded with major storms coming through. The storm surge causes issues. Roads get flooded. Parking lots get flooded. School commutes get flooded. So all of these issues are happening. And we have to think about ways to try to help make it better. And I really love some of these quotes. If you can see at the bottom, one of the quotes from the newspaper is a quote by a Plum Island resident who says, building walls, it's not going to work. You're not going to stop the ocean. It's too powerful. And another one is, it looks like a war. It is a sort of war, but the ocean wins. And I want to reflect these words back to you because they're not coming from me. They're coming from members of your community who think that the ocean is so powerful that trying to hold it back and hold it in place maybe doesn't make sense. So I want you to keep in mind that already there are some people in your community who think that holding the ocean in place is not working and is not going to work. And as bad as this war is right now at this moment, we also know that it's going to get worse. Climate change, of course, is coming, it's happening, it's here, and it's only going to make problems like this more severe. So here we're looking at a tool that was created by Climate Central, cooperating with Zillow and other organizations. They created the Surging Seas Risk Zone map. You can actually zone in and find your own home on here if you're really interested. But at community level, you can see, you can play with the little slider on the left, and you can put in different sea level rise amounts. So if 2 feet of sea level rise, which is what the Massachusetts area is expected to get by 2070, so 50 years from now. It's far, but it's not that far. So this is about 50 years. These are the areas that are going to be flooded, expected to be flooded twice a day at high tide. This is not storm surge. This is not rainfall flooding. This is not severe weather. This is just everyday flooding. So these areas are expected to be primarily underwater. And if we flip to 10 feet of sea level rise, so this is the more severe, if we stay on our current greenhouse gas emissions, this is what Boston and the Massachusetts area are expected to see by about the end of the century, if we do not cut our emissions globally immediately. So we see 10 feet of sea level rise. 10 feet of sea level rise, you can see, is quite a bit more severe, especially areas right along the coast and spreading farther inland. You also see more flooding along these river areas. So a lot of areas quite at risk. And one thing that you'll probably notice is that if I look at a map of the area, a lot of the areas that are expected to be underwater are currently parkland. So actually your community is doing a good job already of using natural resources to absorb floodwaters. Those areas that are green, they're absorbing more flood, they're absorbing these tide waters, and they're protecting the neighborhood behind them. They're creating that flood buffer. So by having that green space next to the ocean, you actually protect the community that's inland. And so already Newbury, Plum Island, doing a good job of starting that. Of course, as you know, and we can see from the maps, there are still communities that are in these at-risk areas. And of course, these, again, are just the high tide. So we know it gets worse. We have where the high tide was historically. We have the storm surge that comes in on top of a high tide, or we have heavy floods due to rainfall. So the rain comes in and then it adds to the tide and it floods areas that are otherwise dry. But as sea level rise, we're going to have even higher water. And so the storm surge will push more people in and more people will start to be at risk. And the areas that are flooded are going to be flooded to deeper and deeper levels. So climate change is going to be one part of this, and then having storms on top of it is going to be another one. So starting with this idea that you're already flooding, you're aware of the risk, and you can see that these things are going to be increasing. So as Mike mentioned, what do we do about this? The 3 major strategies. 1, resist. Prevent the water from getting to your home. Keep it away. This is a picture of the London Thames barrier, but you've also seen seawalls, riprap, groins, jettisons, revetments, all kinds of different protections to keep the water away from your home. Dune systems are also a way to do this. Living shorelines can serve some of the same purposes. So resist, accommodate, retreat. Yes, those are our strategies. And I know that everyone in Massachusetts has been talking a lot about building walls. And why we need to build more walls in order to protect. Massachusetts, of course, has a ban against building seawalls in areas. And one of the reasons they have this ban is because we know that flood walls fail, right? So this picture is the classic breach in New Orleans during the storm in Katrina, but I really could have found any of 100 photos to put in here. The levees breaching in the Midwest river floods in the Mississippi. There's seawalls being breached up and down the East Coast, along the Gulf. Tokyo, Japan just experienced huge problems when their seawalls failed during their last storm. And again, I'm throwing these quotes up here because the purpose of these walls is to hold the ocean back and to try to hold back the entire fury of a hurricane and the entire force of the ocean throwing water at your home. And human engineering can do a lot, but that's a difficult battle to fight. And sometimes we should fight it, and sometimes maybe that's not the battle that we want to be fighting. Newburyport already has coastal armoring in some areas. This is the 2009 Coastal Inventory of Massachusetts looking at armoring in Newburyport. So here's some of the examples of small-scale armoring already throughout the town. One of the things I found notable about this is that, of course, seawalls are expensive to maintain. So in 2009, the estimate was that repairing the seawalls already in Newburyport would cost $2.1 million. That's a one-time repair cost, and then there would be annual maintenance costs in order to try to maintain these at a top peak performance level. There's also an aesthetic cost. With the best will in the world towards Ocean Bluff, Massachusetts, this is not the prettiest beach I've ever seen. In terms of being on the ocean front and enjoying the waterfront, having a riprap boulder wall in front of it is not necessarily the way I would choose to enjoy the ocean. Here's another one, another seawall protecting homes, protecting the roadway, protecting parking areas. And again, it can do a great job of protection, but what trade-off? What else are you not having and not experiencing because you have that wall in place? You may have heard the phrase that good walls make good neighbors. It's actually was made famous by Robert Frost, another New England son. And I enjoy this phrase because the rest of the poem actually talks about why you shouldn't build a wall. He says, "Why do walls make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out." And I think this is important to consider when the alternative is to build a wall. What is it that you're walling out? One of the things that makes places like my hometown of Duluth, Minnesota, and your hometown in Newburyport, Massachusetts, so wonderful and so beautiful is being on the water and being close to the water. And having a giant concrete structure between you and that ocean can separate you. It can reduce the very thing that makes where you are so unique and so beautiful. So in Robert Frost's mind, not just good fences make good neighbors, but what are you walling in and what are you walling out? All right, that's going to be the end of my preaching on walls. And now, as a short turn to accommodation, all I will note here is that elevating the home can work when you're talking about 1 or 2 feet. When you start needing to elevate a home to 10 feet, 15 feet, 21 feet, like in some places in the United States, then you start having major trade-offs. For example, if people in your community are elderly or are disabled, can they access these homes? Can they go visit their neighbors? Can they get up 21 feet of stairs to visit their neighbors next door? Also, when you elevate a home, you and your house may be safe, but how do you get out to get groceries if the road is flooded? How do you get to school? How do you get to work? How do you get to the hospital when there's an emergency? Or how do emergency services get to you? Also, that floodwater is often, as there were recent meetings this summer by the Merrimack River Task Force that was looking at contamination from the local septic systems into the floodwaters. So I remind you that all across the United States, this isn't unique to you, but this is also something that you will probably see in your community. When you see those floodwaters, they're not pristine, clean ocean water. They've been filtering through the septic system. And so oftentimes floodwaters contain sewage, and so they spread disease and contamination. So just because you're safe in your home, if you're safe in your home above 3 feet of contaminated floodwater, is that really the option you want to experience? So accommodation is an option, and it works in some places, and then in other places it doesn't. And it can be altered and done in many different ways. And the one that we're really here to talk about, of course, is retreat. And retreat also is going to have pros and cons. What I want to say here is not that any of these options are right or wrong, but that they all come with trade-offs. And what I want you to be thinking about when you think about what's best for your home or for your community is which trade-offs you're willing to make. So let's talk about how retreat actually happens in the United States. Most managed retreat in the United States, and I'm going to say managed retreat here because managed retreat is when the government or a community organization gets involved and helps organize and coordinate the retreat. It is not just people moving away, abandoning their homes. It's an organized system in which people are helped to relocate. So most relocation and most managed retreat in the United States starts with a federal government agency, oftentimes FEMA, sometimes it's HUD, but it's often FEMA. They provide funding to a grant recipient. The grant recipient is usually the state government. The state government provides funding to a sub-recipient or a sub-grantee, who is usually the city or the county. And then the city or the county actually goes in and negotiates with homeowners one-on-one, where they decide to offer them a purchase. Whether or not the homeowner takes that purchase is up to the homeowner. In the United States, we do not use forced relocation or eminent domain for flood risk reduction. At least it's very, very isolated. The majority of managed retreat in the United States, the vast majority, is through voluntary buyouts. In fact, if a local government decides to use a voluntary buyout, they cannot go back and use eminent domain. So if they make a voluntary purchase offer, that's what they're doing. It's supposed to be very, very voluntary. So the property owner decides whether or not to take that offer. If they take the offer, then the city or county now owns the property. They either relocate or they demolish the home. And then the land is supposed to be kept as open public space. So nothing else can be built on it. Can't redevelop it as condos or shopping malls or anything like that. Usually it turns into a city park, or it can be community gardens, it could be baseball fields, it could be a restored wetland. It depends on what the community feels is most appropriate for that land and for the community. So this is how managed retreat most often works in the United States. And it's been done a lot. So we recently published a study in Science Advances. It came out last month, where we looked at all of the federal data on buyouts, these purchasing of flood-prone homes. And it's been happening all over the United States, 49 states. Hawaii is the only state in the US that hasn't used this program to purchase and demolish flood-prone homes in order to do managed retreat. And you can see it's spread out all over. It's 1,100 counties, which is actually 1 in 3 counties. So 1 in 3 counties in the United States has done managed retreat. They've done it on a small scale, but they have used it as a strategy because they have found value in it. This also includes Massachusetts and New England. You can see here, this is a map of where New England has done a series of voluntary purchases, a lot in Vermont, in the river areas. Those rivers cause a lot of damage, and so those flash floods. Massachusetts has done fewer buyouts, as you can see by the map, but they've used FEMA buyouts in 91, 92, 97, 98, 2000, 2006. So this is not an isolated event, and it's not something that's new to Massachusetts. Massachusetts has done this before. New England has done this before. The United States has done this before. What's new is that we're starting to talk about doing it at a larger scale. Not just 1 or 2 homes, but now let's talk about a whole block, potentially a whole neighborhood being moved, so that we can make more space for those natural buffers that Newburyport, Plum Island, Newbury are already doing so well. How can we do more of that all across the United States? It's actually, I find it fascinating, at least. Massachusetts is one of the earliest examples I can find in the United States of managed retreat. So this picture is from Long Point, Cape Cod, where newspapers at the time described them as having sharks in their front yard. That's how water prone and flood prone they were. And so they decided to relocate. So they actually floated their homes across the bay, and you can still see some of the homes over in Provincetown Harbor, mostly on the west end. Some have moved to the east end. So this picture is actually from 1890, when this house relocated from the west end to the east end. So as far back as the 1890s, people in Massachusetts were already realizing that some of the coast was just too flood prone to be sustainable. And so they moved their homes. They picked up their entire community and they left. And I mention this because I think it's fascinating that we have such a long history and a long culture of relocation and of moving and of knowing that these communities are transitory. They're there for a while to enjoy the beauty of the ocean, and then they move to make space for something new. So why should we talk about managed retreat right now? It's been going on since the 1850s, but why is this an important discussion to have today, right? Why are you spending your time talking to me or listening to me talk? One of the things is that change is inevitable. And for me, the 1850s example is a fascinating case of this because it shows how long this transformation has been happening. Again, growing up in Minnesota, we grew up very close to the Iron Range, a place where a lot of communities changed because the economy and the iron ore mines changed. And so entire towns decided they needed to move. They had to chase economic prosperity. They weren't driven away by waves or floods, but they still had to face change. And what they learned on the Iron Range is that a town that isn't changing is often dying. So change is a natural part of towns and communities experiencing how are they going to redefine themselves. And sometimes that means moving one part of town to another part of town. So we know change is coming. Even if you decide to stay exactly where your home is today, and you never want to move, and what you decide to do is build a wall in front of your home, that is still going to change the nature of your home and of your town. If Newburyport's shoreline suddenly looked like this, it would be a very different community. If Newburyport had homes that were on 15-foot stilts, it would be a very different community. So no matter what adaptation option you choose, because the climate is changing, your community is also going to change. Climate change and adaptation are like aging. It's going to happen. All you get to do is choose how you want to handle it. And so you can handle it by deciding to armor and stay in place if you can get a legal exception from Massachusetts. You can decide to elevate your home and try and stay in place, or you can decide that moving a mile or two to the other side of town is the right decision. And this is completely up to you. Again, I'm not going to tell you to relocate. I'm going to tell you to consider it and to consider it for your town. So sea level rise is coming. Even if we stopped emitting carbon tomorrow, we still would experience the effects of sea level rise for the foreseeable future. For all of the time that matters to us, our children, and our grandchildren, we would still be experiencing sea level rise. And that is going to have significant implications for your town and for anyone who's living near the water. It's going to make living near the water much more difficult. So one thing it's going to do is it's going to change property values. So this is by First Foundation. They put out Flood IQ. You can go in, I've masked out, I picked a random home in Newburyport, and you can go in and put in your address and see how climate change has affected the value of your home over time. And for this home, since 2005, this home has lost $4,000 in value because it is flooded and because floods occur nearby it and because roads to access this home have occurred and have affected the home value. In the next 15 years, it's expected to lose about another $5,000 worth in value. Nationwide, estimates are around $7,000 a year homes are losing value for being in flood-prone areas. It ranges between about 4% and 12% of the value of the home. So it depends on the location and how they're being adapted, et cetera. But even in areas where homes are being protected, again, if you can't protect the entire neighborhood, all of the critical infrastructure, the business district, and the roads that access that home, then whether or not the house itself is safe is not the only factor in determining the value of the home. So as sea level rise comes, home values are going to decrease. This is going to be a potential problem for people who are counting on their home values for their retirements, for investments, who can't afford other affordable housing nearby. So this is a major concern. The same man who predicted the housing crash in 2008, the inspiration for that movie, The Big Short, so he's now predicting a similar crash due to flood and coastal properties being exposed to risk and not properly evaluating that. In fact, he's bet on it so severely that he quit his job with his accounting firm and he's now started up his own venture where he expects to make billions on the fact that people are not moving away from the coast. So there are a lot of people who expect that this kind of property value may not hold its value no matter how we adapt. One of the other things that is expected to happen in flood-prone areas is to have insurance rates rise. So we've already seen some of this with the National Flood Insurance Program. The National Flood Insurance Program is $20 billion in debt, and that's after Congress forgave a $16 billion worth of debt. So the program needs to increase premium rates, and this is going to happen very slowly because Congress is concerned about raising prices too fast and pricing people out of the market, but it is starting to happen. We're starting to see this occur at about a 5 to 8% increase annually. So as flood insurance premiums go up, the value of the homes is going to go down, and the ability of people to afford living in those homes is expected to change. So whatever you're paying currently for flood insurance, and I'm going to cross my fingers that if you live in the flood zone, you have flood insurance, because we can have a whole other conversation about that, but it's a really important thing to protect yourself and your home. So people who have flood insurance are going to see those prices go up, and that's going to affect their ability to stay in these areas. One thing that will happen if home values are decreasing and the price of living in these at-risk areas is going up due to flood insurance, then we actually expect to see people just leave, like just straight up abandon their homes and walk away. We already see this after major disasters. After Harvey and Katrina, thousands of people just left those cities. After Katrina, a decade after Katrina, there were roughly 40,000 vacant homes in New Orleans. Not all of them due to Katrina, but quite a number of them due to people who were just fed up with being flooded and didn't want to handle it anymore. If we look at Newburyport, we can see a vacancy rate. So this is just a very quick and dirty based on the census. You can see a vacancy rate. Darker colors mean areas in Newburyport that have higher vacancies. You can see a higher vacancy area up in near Browns Point. Apologies, I'm sure I'm labeling the neighborhood wrong. And what I find interesting about this is if you keep your eye on that dark area of higher vacancy, you can see that it correlates very nicely to the area of high flood risk. And so areas, as we expect to see all across the United States, areas of higher flood risk sometimes have a higher vacancy rate because people are just leaving and no one else wants to move in. So if the people have wanted to leave for a variety of reasons and no one else wants to move in, you end up with these more patchwork neighborhoods. So rather than having the coherent neighborhood that you've had for the last 30 years, there are holes in it. There are empty pockets. You can also have a lot of people who get stuck, who really, really want to leave and then get stuck. We're seeing a lot of discussion of this coming out of Houston after Harvey. So we see people with these, if you can't read these headlines, brutal choice in Houston, sell home at a loss or face new floods, and build, flood, repeat. Flood insurance is expensive cycle. So people who want to get out, who can't afford the flood insurance, don't want to rebuild their homes, or just don't want to experience the trauma of living through flood after flood after flood, or the hassle, they're stuck. They don't have an option. How do they leave? Can you just walk away from your home and the financial investment you've made in it? And when I think about how hard that it would be to take that financial hit, and then I think about the fact that thousands of people have made that decision. They have walked away from that financial asset because they did not want to deal with the flood. That is one of the biggest things that convinces me that we need a program to help those people. So even if you're sitting in the audience and you're saying, I will never sell, that's fine. There's probably someone else in the audience who does want to sell and they want to get out. And the reason we should talk about managed retreat and think about managed retreat is to help those people who do want out, get out without losing everything financially. Helping people when they decide to leave is also really helpful for the neighborhood who remains. So here's a picture of one of those abandoned homes, right, in New Orleans. Can you imagine being the neighbor sitting next to that vacant lot? That's not going to be great for their sense of community, for their safety, for their property values. So wouldn't it be better if that were either an occupied home that was well taken care of, or frankly, an empty lot with a community garden on it, or a grassy soccer field, or something else that was being used for the benefit of the community? So helping people get out is helpful both for the people who are leaving and for the community who remains behind. And key planning is really important in order to put these processes in place. We can't wait until people are leaving and losing everything. We have to put a program in place now so that when people reach that breaking point, they have something that they can turn to. And there's a system in place to help think about where should they go. If people move away from the coast in a place like Newburyport, where should they go? Do you want them to stay in the community? If so, where is Newburyport going to build new housing that's affordable for those people in order to help them remain in the community? If it's important to keep the people nearby, then it's important to think about where that housing goes that will replace some of these vulnerable places when they are too flood prone. So how should you think about retreat? I've told you about why I think you should think about retreat, but how should you think about it? The number one recommendation here is to think about managed retreat as a process. It is not a one and done. You don't simply do one buyout and then never think about managed retreat again. It's an ongoing process. Again, you may not want to retreat now. You may not need to retreat now. No one may need to. It may be a decade from now. It may be 2 decades from now. It may be 3 or 4 or 5 decades from now. But it's going to take time to put a process in place to help that happen. And so starting now can make that process work more smoothly when it becomes time to have managed retreat occur. For example, maybe you don't want to leave your home. You are very, very sure you are not going to leave your home. But maybe you should be the last person to live in your home. Maybe you shouldn't sell it to a new family with small children, or a family with health problems who needs access to a hospital and who can't deal with or afford the cost of being flooded over and over. So maybe you should be the last family to live in your home, and once you decide to move, or once the elderly members have passed on, maybe then it's time for that home to transition to the local government. When that time comes, will the local government be able and ready to pay for it? Will they have a plan for how to use that land? Will they know how to deal with the neighbors and how to think about the sense of community that's left behind? So even if you're not thinking about retreat today, even if you're thinking about it several decades from now, it's still useful to think about this plan because it's far more difficult than putting in a concrete wall. And so it's something that needs a lot more advanced planning and a lot more community discussion. It's not something that we want to see happen just one house at a time. It's something that should happen a town at a time, or even a region at a time, better yet. So one thing, as I said, is to think about this process. Another thing is to think about how you're going to preserve your sense of community when people do start moving away from the community, when they decide not to live on the waterfront, whether it's you or whether that's your neighbor. How are you going to maintain your ties to each other and to the land that you still have? One way people do this is through memorials. So this is a photo of the Flood Museum in the Netherlands, hit by a major storm in the 1950s, killed over 1,800 people. And those white lights that look like rippling light on the water, those are actually the names of all 1,800 people that died in that flood. And this is part of a very large museum that was put in place to help people remember the flood, to remember what was there before the flood and before they relocated away from some of these at-risk places. We often use the Dutch as an example to say, why don't we do what the Dutch do? Why don't we build levees? And the answer is, we do build levees. You know what the Dutch also do? They relocate people away from at-risk places. So yes, we should be like the Dutch. We should build some walls in some places, and we should relocate other people away from areas that are too at risk. And we should do it in a process that involves them and makes them happy about it. So memorials like this one can help because they can really educate people about the risks that they face, about the answers and the solutions that other people took before them, and they can help them remember why we don't live right next to the water in this space. Another example of this is Japanese tsunami stones. So in communities that were destroyed going back almost 1,000 years by tsunamis, some communities left these markers, and these markers serve as memorials in some places, documenting people or towns who were here and who were lost in that tsunami. And they also serve as a warning to future generations. Do not build closer to the shore than this memorial, because this is where the floodwaters come. So both memorials can help tie people to the land. They can help memorialize what was there, and they can help you remember why it is that you decided to make this trade-off and live somewhere a little bit farther away from the shore. There are other steps you can take to try and maintain community. One of my favorites is here. This is Portsmouth Homecoming. So down in North Carolina, a long time ago, over 100 years ago, this community relocated away from the coast off a barrier island because it was too risky. They lived on a barrier island and there were too many storms and too much flooding, and so the town disappeared. That little church that is owned by the National Park Service now is part of a national park, and it's part of an educational service that brings people in and talks to them about flood risk and about the town's relocation and about the history of the area. And once every year or every other year, they host a homecoming where they invite anyone who is interested in the history of the town, anyone who's ever lived here, anyone who has a family connection going back to this town, to come together and celebrate. So even though all of these people have moved away from this town, they still have a way to maintain ties and connections and a sense of place and connection to this place where they used to live. It's a demonstration that you don't have to live right on the water in order to have a connection to the water and to the space. And so Managed Retreat is not about everyone moving to Iowa. I'm from Minnesota. I wouldn't recommend people move to Iowa, of course. It's about not even about you moving to Western Massachusetts. It's about thinking about whether or not it would help you and your community and your state if maybe in a few decades you moved a few miles inland, maybe one town over, and you visited the ocean and you came back for memorials and you came back for homecoming celebrations to see all of your neighbors and friends and relatives. And when the storms came, you didn't live there. And your family mementos and your belongings and your possessions and your financial assets weren't sitting there in the storm's path. It's a calculation only you can make. But this kind of homecoming, I think, helps people who are afraid that they're going to lose that sense of community. It helps them know that even if they move away, they will still be connected to you and still be part of your community. This is one of those things where I talk about planning. Putting something together like this requires planning, and it requires thinking about it in advance. How are you going to maintain community even after people leave? Another question is, how are you going to use the land? Are you going to make it into public parks? Are you going to turn it into wetlands? I'm showing a picture of a prairie here because one of my favorite examples of what people have done with land is actually in Houston, Texas. They took small parcels of land, relatively small parcels of land that were acquired through Managed Retreat, and they turned them into what they call pocket prairies. So they've created prairies in the middle of the city, and they are actually now habitat for an endangered bird species. And they help this species recover and create biodiversity, as well as improving air pollution and providing a green space, which helps the community and helps the city as a whole. So there's a lot of creative things that can be done. Community parks, baseball fields, floodplains, wetland restoration, all great answers. What creative thing would you like to see happen if you decided to leave your home? You don't even have to say when, just if you decided to leave or if your neighbor left, what would you want to see happen on that space in order for people to remember the community that was and to help improve the community that still is there? One of the big points, I'm going backwards now. One of the big points I want to talk about is seeing managed retreat as an opportunity. It's a scary thing. People talk about it as a negative all the time, but it can also be an opportunity. And my favorite quote about retreat comes from US Marine Corps General Oliver P. Smith. He led a major retreat during the Korean War. And his quote is, "Retreat? Hell. We're just advancing in a different direction." And I love this quote because it's so oorah, right? So Marine Corps. Like, we're not retreating. No. But it also has a really clear truth to it. Sometimes we think about retreat as though it means defeat, as though it means losing. Think about those quotes I started with that talked about being in a war with the ocean. Does it make sense to say that we're in a war with the ocean? We love the ocean. That's why we live near the ocean. That's why we live in oceanfront states, in oceanfront cities, in oceanfront towns. So to say we're in a war with the ocean, does that make sense? Maybe instead what we should be doing is picking our battles. It's not about losing a war with the ocean. It's about picking a battle and deciding that holding the ocean in place, holding it at bay, maybe there are other things we could do instead. Maybe there are other better directions for us to go. And I want to think about this as an opportunity because there are positive changes. Almost every town has something that they would change if they could. If they could go back and wipe the slate clean, they would have roads that make sense. They would put the school in a different place, put the hospital in a different place, get rid of that one way that doesn't make any sense. Whatever it is, there's things they would change. And managed retreat offers an opportunity to wipe the slate clean in some places and think about creatively, how would you use this land and what do you want your community to look like? How could we restructure this community if we shuffled the pieces a little bit? If we put homes over here instead of up in front, if we put them over to the side, what would that look like instead? Some great examples of this are communities that relocated their entire community out of the Midwest. So two of my favorite examples are Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin and Valmeyer, Illinois. Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin actually relocated back in the 1970s, and they did a lot of interesting things. They relocated away from a river. They moved up towards the freeway so that they'd be closer to transportation, closer to passerby traffic, so they'd increase their economy. But one of the most innovative things they did is they decided to pass a regulation to make their town solar. Now, I want to reemphasize, in the 1970s in Wisconsin, a rural town decided that its business district should go solar. So they became known briefly as Solar Town. Their population grew. They had some business interest. And it's a really innovative way to think about their town wasn't just retreating away from floodwater. Their town was thinking about how they could reinvent themselves and see this move away from risk as a way, as an opportunity, as a window to take advantage and to change things that would help their town into the future. Valmeyer, Illinois did very similarly in the 1990s. Major river floods, the town decided that it was going to relocate away from the low area next to the water and up onto higher ground. So during a long process, they renegotiated, and they actually did some really innovative things. They had a major cave infrastructure nearby that they now lease to a food warehouse distribution company. So they're actually paid for trucks to be able to store cold food in the underground caves. They found a endangered species of bat in the local trails, so they got money to put in a trail system to help bring in tourism from nature lovers. While they redesigned this city, they found other ways to redefine themselves as a community and to breathe new life into it. So people's property values actually went up, population grew, and the town is now 26 years later, thriving. When it was about to be destroyed because people wanted to abandon the town after a series of major floods. So taking the opportunity for managed retreat, not just to be about retreat, but in the words of General Smith, to be about advancing in a different direction. What is the direction you want Newburyport to go in? And the question here is really, where do you want Newburyport to be in 100 years? I pulled up a map of Newburyport, Massachusetts from 1894 from the Library of Congress. And it's obvious looking at this map and looking at the maps I showed before of your town, that your town has changed a lot, not surprisingly, in the last 100 years. How much is it going to change in the next 100 years? Are you going to do everything you can to fight and try to keep it to be exactly what it was in 1894? Or do you have a secret vision that would make the town better, make the town even more what you want it to be in 2094? Certainly, there are parts of the path past that are worth holding on to. I am not advocating for getting rid of historic sites or heritage or the cultural pieces that make places unique. But while keeping and maintaining some of that heritage, there's still room for change and to think about what else you want your town to look at. And managed retreat can play a role in that, because instead of investing your time, energy, and money into maintaining exactly what you have, you could be thinking as a community about where you want to go in the future and how you want things to change. And managed retreat, shuffling where the housing is, can play a big role in that, because it's also shuffling where your investments and where you're tied down to. The decisions you make today will influence that. It may seem like 2094 is a really long ways away, but I like to think that the Boston subway was opened in 1897. Right? So since the Boston subway was built, it completely defined the way that Boston grew as a town. It altered that growth patterns that are still happening now. So the infrastructure that you decide to lay down today, how you handle the water quality issues, how you handle flooding, where you put that new road, where you decide the new school district should go, or which schools should be expanded and which should be contracted, that's going to influence where people live and how they live for the next 100 years. So it's not just thinking about today or the next decade, but thinking about how the decisions you're going to make will shape Newburyport for the coming future. And is that the direction you want to go? You can't stay where you are. No one wants to go backwards. So what's your new direction that you're going to advance in? And what role can buyouts and strategic reallocation of where homes are actually placed play in thinking about the new Newburyport that you want to think about? So I apologize, I probably went a little fast there at the end, but now I'd like to open it up for questions. If you have any questions, I'm happy to talk about how managed retreat happens, or why Newburyport should, or what it would look like.
If you have questions for Ms. Siders, what we'd like you to do is come up here and just speak right into my computer, and she'll respond up on the screen.
Hi. So I'm curious how the valuations are determined during government buyouts.
So home purchase price is based on pre-disaster fair market value. My best understanding, talking to a number of practitioners here, is that they look at a variety. They usually have appraisers come in and actually look at home value from photos or tax records or whatever was there before a disaster strikes. Of course, it depends on how damaged your home is. If your home has only experienced a few inches of flooding, the appraiser can usually determine what the value would have been before the flood. If your home is completely demolished, then they have to do more of a historical record. But the town or county government will have an appraiser assess the value of the home before the flood damage occurred. If the homeowner wants, the homeowner can have a second appraisal done, and then there can even be a third to sort of decide any discrepancies between the two. Some other places, other towns use tax assessed value instead of having appraisers come in, but there's still an option for the homeowner to have an appraisal done as well if they don't agree with the tax assessment.
I have a question also. The properties on the beach generate a lot of the city's revenue, and if we retreat and turn that into parkland, it'll be devastating for some time to the maintenance of the city's budgets and so forth. How would that be handled?
Absolutely. This is one of those areas where pre-planning is really critical, thinking about alternate revenue streams. So alternate revenue streams could mean in some places people have put in more sales tax, or because that parkland can then be used to attract tourists or outside residents, maybe putting in a tax, occupancy tax on hotels or other amenities that are used by those tourists who come to visit that parkland can help offset the loss in property tax revenue. Also, providing more housing in other areas of the town can be a good way to offset the housing that's lost right on the beach. This is an area where there's a lot of research still going on, I will say. As I pointed out, there's 1,100 communities all across the United States, including coastal ones, that have done managed retreat and have not collapsed financially. And so one of the open questions we're trying to figure out is what are all of those strategies that they've engaged in? So sales tax, replacing the housing, and finding other streams of revenue is one area, but I'm sure that there are others as we dig farther into this.
My question is, I don't know whether you're aware of waterfront development here in Newburyport, and it just baffles me how investors can continue to be planning waterfront development with everything we know right now. Can you comment on that, and can you help me understand if there's other places in the country where investors are continually investing in waterfront property, and how is it insured? Thank you.
It's a really big problem. So yes, in the United States, actually, waterfront areas are developing faster than safe areas. One estimation by Climate Central and Zillow found that New Jersey, North Carolina, and Florida, in the last 10 years, they've added 9,000 homes into the 1 in 10 year flood zone. So a home that has a 10% chance of flooding every single year, and they've added 9,000 of those homes. And the answer is, partly what the gentleman before asked about property tax revenue, the local governments get property tax revenue. So why on earth should they stop the development? They get money from it. So they allow development to occur in places that they know are at risk. The developers don't bear any of the cost when the flood comes or the damage happens. They build the home and then they leave. And so they don't have to deal with the consequences. In terms of how these homes are insured, if they have a federally backed mortgage, then they will be insured through federally funded national flood insurance. And so you and I and every other federal taxpayer will subsidize their being able to live in those places by helping pay for the insurance premiums, because insurance premiums do not reflect the entire risk of those areas. One of the best things communities can do who are facing flood risk and have long-term expenses is stop developing in flood-prone areas. And I do not know the particulars of Newburyport and the water development that is going on there, but I know that Delaware is doing a lot of development on the floodplain. And one of the best things we could do as a state is we could stop that development, because all it does is create a drain for future resources when we then have to go in and build walls and protect those places, or help elevate those homes, or bail out people after disasters, or eventually buy out those homes at their full market value and then pay to help people get somewhere else. It would be so much better if we could stop that development now, keep people safe, and then also save that cost that we're eventually going to sink into those areas. So without knowing any of the particulars of the place, there are probably good reasons why they're trying to develop there. But as a general statement in the US, this is a real problem that we're trying to solve. Another real problem is, do the people who are moving into those homes, do they know what risk they're facing? Do they know if they will have to purchase flood insurance programs, flood insurance premiums? The National Resources Defense Council did a great study looking at the different states and how states have different flood disclosure requirements. In some states, you are not required to disclose at all whether your home has had flood damage. Even if your home has been completely demolished 10 times, 12 times, 11 times, you don't have to even tell the purchaser. And I always think this is amazing, because I can find out if my car has had a dented bumper, but I can't find out if the home I'm about to buy, the biggest purchase I will probably make in my life, has been completely destroyed, and if I will have to pay thousands of dollars a year for flood insurance. So disclosure laws can also go a long ways towards helping homeowners make an appropriate choice as to whether or not they want to take that gamble. So I can't help you understand it, but at least I can help you share my frustration.
Hi. When a house is destroyed and the insurance program pays out, can that homeowner use that money to relocate, or do they have to rebuild in the same vulnerable position?
Yes, they can. Most don't, because you can get the insurance payouts and then rebuild in place, but some can relocate. There's actually there's some advocacy happening right now in Congress, because one thing that happens in a number of communities is that the federal government will pay out the insurance money, a homeowner will rebuild, and then 2 or 3 or 5 years later, the local government will come and ask that homeowner if they want to sell to the government, and the homeowner will sell. So the federal government has effectively paid for the home twice. And so this is happening around the country. And so one way to try to work around this that people are advocating for, Natural Resources Defense Council, Charlotte, North Carolina is on the front edges of this. Others are trying to look at how can they better use insurance money to help people relocate, and to use that money not just to help people leave that property, but to actually transfer that property to the government and use the insurance money as part of the purchase price.
Stan Liftman from Plum Island. One of the things that's happening on our southern border is that people are migrating because they can't harvest their crops, because they're facing heat stroke, they die from kidney failure. And so people migrate. What happens when tens of millions of people who are living in the southern part of this country need to migrate? How are we going to relocate them?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question that there's some great people working on this in the Gulf Coast, especially looking at, for example, at a smaller scale, thinking about the thousands and thousands of people who left New Orleans after Katrina. Where did they go? How did they do? How did the towns that received them think about their infrastructure? The good thing is that it's highly unlikely. We won't really see 10 million people suddenly relocate tomorrow. We might start to see a trickle over time as people relocate. And so there will be a slow increase in some of these areas. And one of the key questions is going to be, where will they go? And how can we either direct them by creating amenities so that they want to go certain places? My hometown of Duluth, Minnesota is actually trying to position itself as a climate destination. So they want people, migrants from these areas that are very devastated by climate change, to come move to Duluth. Duluth used to be known as the air-conditioned city because it's on Lake Superior, and so it gets this cool lake effect air. So no matter how hot it is anywhere else, Duluth is always air-conditioned. It has a lot of infrastructure, it has great hospitals, good schools, and so they are trying to position themselves saying, you need somewhere to go, come here. And it's because Duluth sees it as a benefit to have more people move in. One of the difficulties about people moving into those areas is going to be, will Duluth have enough housing? Will it have enough affordable housing? And how will it increase its infrastructure to get that influx? The likelihood is that this will happen over a slow period of time so that towns like Duluth will have time to prepare. A little closer to you, Buffalo, New York is also doing the same thing. They're advertising themselves as a climate destination because they want that influx of tax dollars. They want that influx of young, employable population and work labor and amazing culture. So there are towns that are trying to attract people there. And hopefully it happens slowly enough that we can have the infrastructure keep up with those changes. But I think places that pitch themselves as destinations will have the best chance of putting that infrastructure in place in advance because they won't be caught unawares.
Hi. I wish we could have, I wish the connection had been more stable because we did lose quite a lot in listening to you. But one of my questions is the projections that we keep hearing about how high the ocean will rise. It seems like, every other day we hear something that says, oh, it's going to happen quicker than that. And so what is the consensus now? Is, I don't know, what are people saying for sure, or are people getting more alarmed with the, with more that they see? And by people, I mean scientists, so.
Yeah, the projections vary quite a lot. As you say, there's new ones coming out every time. Sorry, I'm trying to move back to find some of these maps on the sea level rise. They vary by projection, by the model, putting in the latest data. So there's a lot of variation depending on who runs the model, which model they're using, whether or not they're considering rainfall or storm surge, or whether they're just looking at, they call it the bathtub model, where you just kind of put the water in and let everything rise up evenly. So whether they look at that. When the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change comes out, they give estimates of global sea level rise. As soon as the IPCC comes out, it's already out of date because it has a year and a half long approval process. So the best it can do is report science that's a year and a half old. So the estimates are always going to lag behind science and the consensus. Here I'm showing somewhere between 2 and 10 feet. It's a huge range. And the huge range, the uncertainty doesn't come from will it happen? The uncertainty is how quickly will we stop emitting greenhouse gases? If we stop very quickly, we could, Newburyport could see as little as 2 feet, maybe not even a full 2 feet. But that's, if we all go vegan, drive Teslas, and stop emitting carbon, stop flying places. I'm not holding my breath for that to happen tomorrow or even this year. I would love to see it happen. I'd love to be wrong, but I'm not optimistic about that. If we continue emitting the way that we are for the rest of the century, that's when we get up to these 10-foot estimates. And these are not the worst case scenarios. 10 feet is not the worst case scenario for New England. The worst case scenario is far, far worse because it involves major ice sheets melting in Antarctica and all kinds of other additions from Greenland and other glaciers that, frankly, most climate scientists, we don't talk about. Climate scientists don't talk about because they're so often accused of fear mongering, accused of saying it's worse, like you're saying it's so bad, but it's really not going to be that bad. So no one wants to talk about 20 or 30 feet of sea level rise or more. So we talk about 2 to 10. You'll notice Climate Central's meter doesn't even go higher than 10 feet because they don't want to be accused of scaremongering. So the uncertainty that you'll see in these numbers is really just about when do we stop emitting? And because we don't know that, we don't have great uncertainty about how it'll be. But for the area in which you are at, somewhere in this 2 to 10 range is a very safe bet, which I realize is a huge error margin. I'm sorry I don't have a more particular answer for you on that.
Hi, Dr. Siders. Thanks for presenting to us tonight. One question I have is kind of related to, I think, an article and a paper that came out a couple weeks ago with buyouts through FEMA. In New England, we have really small towns that don't have full-time staff all the time, and they have trouble capacity-wise putting the resources toward actually managing a buyout program and actually dealing with the state and applying for the grants and figuring out who to give the buyouts to within the town. And so clearly the system is problematic, and I'm wondering if you could speak to your thoughts on that a little bit more and some of the research around that topic.
The paper I believe you're talking about is actually Mock et al. In Science Advances, and I'm one of the co-authors at the end of it. So the map I showed of all of the FEMA buyouts is from that paper. So we looked at all of the FEMA buyouts all across the country, and then we looked at who's actually doing these buyouts. And what we find is that counties that are denser and have more money are more likely to use buyouts, and it's exactly for the reasons that you stated. They have planners, they have staff, they have the resources to be able to navigate FEMA's bureaucracy, and then they have the resources to actually deal with appraisals and sit down and talk with every single homeowner about whether or not they want to be bought out. They have the resources to do something with the land afterwards, or at least think about that afterwards. So this is actually an open question. It's something where we hope to go in the future, is what happens then to the communities who don't have the resources or struggle to do manage retreat and think about how to do manage retreat. One strategy that I think works very well, although I just have anecdotes to back this up, but it appears to be that states, and I'll pick on New Jersey here. So New Jersey has a Blue Acres program. It's all across the state. So there's state officials and state staff who actually help administer the buyouts. They apply for the FEMA funding, they handle all the FEMA bureaucracy and the FEMA reporting, they take a lot of the burden off of the local governments. So when a state can take that burden upon itself, it can even the playing field, because suddenly those small towns that don't have the resources to act on their own can act through a state program like Blue Acres. So I actually think that state level can be really important. The state level coordination can also help people. If people want to move away from one town and move somewhere else, they can help. How do you find affordable housing? How do you find a town that has the infrastructure to take an influx of even 100 people? So states can help with a lot of those issues if they're aware of a desire in local governments or in towns for that kind of relocation. One reason a lot of states are hesitant to engage is that they think that they'll meet with a lot of local resistance. And in some places they are going to meet with heavy resistance, but some places we know communities want buyouts and they want help and they're just waiting for government to help them.
I want to thank you for your presentation and your insights and talking about this topic. I mean, even within the Resiliency Committee, it was a difficult topic to talk about, bringing it up as a strategy for certain areas of the community and talking about, well, what are we going to do without all the tax revenue after 2050? You know, that's people aren't just going to pay taxes on houses they can't live in. And even committee members really didn't want to talk about it. So it's good to get the topic out there and talk about what people are comfortable with in terms of where they live. I mean, I used to be We used to own a house on Plum Island, and for us, the threshold was fairly low in terms of when was it time to retreat. For me, it was a financial one. We were sort of upside down in the house because of all the disaster that was happening down there, even though our house wasn't even threatened. But we were upside down in the house by over $100,000. And we had a son going to college, and you know, I'm into the whole climate change thing and the sea level rise thing, and I watch the weather a lot, and I see all these storms just miss us, and nobody talks about it because it's not news because it didn't hit. But I'm like, wow, that was a really close call. So for me, the threshold was really low. And when the market recovered and a cash buyer walked in, I, in good conscience, could say, yep, this person's probably going to at least have this house another 30 years, and I can get out from underneath this. And we came out almost even in the end. So, but that was my threshold. It was fairly low compared to most people because I just knew too much. So anyway, it's a personal decision, right? It's whatever your comfort level is. And I think the key to, you know, retreat in terms of homes is removing some of the barriers, especially the financial ones, with regards to how do you fund buyouts, how do you get people even in their investments so that they're not just throwing the kitchen sink in front of their house trying to keep the ocean away, that they actually have a path to leave when they do decide to leave. And those are things that we need to figure out.
I think that's a really important, and that story resonates with so many we hear from all over the country. And I imagine, you know, what if you hadn't had a cash buyer come in, you know, if you'd been stuck? And that's where I think that it can be really useful to have the community and a government thinking about offering buyouts for people who want out and maybe don't have that option. You know, maybe the next person to try to sell won't be so lucky. And I think you're absolutely right that the conversation needs to start. Even if people aren't ready, it is a very personal decision. It's one that people come to on their own. Everyone has their own risk tolerance level. But the only decision I can say that is really harmful is to not think about it. It's not a problem that will go away by pretending it's not happening. That will only make it worse. So the more we can talk about it and the more we can plan for it, the better the answers will be, no matter what those answers are, whether they're staying in place or retreating. They will be better the more we talk about it. So I really applaud you all for thinking about these issues. I apologize that the presentation did not come through clearly, but I hope you'll be able to see the recording, or please feel free to reach out to me and ask any questions. I'm happy to engage afterwards. So very much want to do whatever I can to support this communication and this conversation continuing in your community.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I don't know if you can see the crowd. All right. Well, that concludes our presentation for tonight. And I appreciate you all hanging in there. I know it was a little bit difficult, but I think we got something out of it. And like I said, if we don't have your email address, please leave that with us, and we'll send you the cloud recording of this presentation without all the gaps. Thanks again.